When it comes to carrier fighter aircraft of the Second World War, there is one very notable attribute that they generally share: air-cooled radial engines. This type of power plant was preferred because it was considered far more reliable, especially for naval combat. After all, damage to the cooling system of any aircraft fitted with a liquid-cooled engine would rapidly mean the loss of the aircraft, probably long before it could get close to its home carrier. Radials were also, broadly speaking, simpler in maintenance than comparable inline engines. Again, an important factor for carrier air groups, where keeping aircraft flying was done in far more cramped and complex conditions than on an airfield. It is notable that the only exceptions to the use of radial engines in carrier fighters were by Germany and Italy, who built basically conversions of existing fighters which never flew off a flight deck and therefore don't really count, and the British, who built the Fairey Fulmar, Firefly, and the Supermarine Seafire. This was largely due to the fact that the British didn't get a decent enough radial engine into service until towards the end of the war, and they basically went all in with the Rolls-Royce Merlin and Griffon. As a result, the best carrier fighter the British produced that saw combat in that role during World War II was the Seafire, which if you see my video on, you will know was a variable quantity. So the epic carrier actions that today get most of the attention were flown by aircraft like the Mitsubishi Zero and its great rivals the F-4 Wildcat, F-6 Hellcat, and the F-4U Corsair. But the US Navy, despite officially stating that they would not be buying any inline-powered aircraft from as early as 1921, still kept an eye on aircraft with those power plants and occasionally toyed with the idea of bringing them into service. One example of this is the 1938 Bell Era Bonita, very broadly a navalised P-39 that competed to be the US Navy's new fighter. Though that aircraft wasn't selected for service, losing out to the Vought Corsair, the Navy did continue to display interest in liquid-cooled aircraft, actually investing in Lycoming's XH-2470 H-block 24-cylinder engine with a view to fitting it onto the Curtiss XF-14C naval interceptor. And even before that project ultimately fizzled out, the Navy was still closely watching other developments in the field. They received one of the early Mustang Mark Is that the US government had retained from the Royal Air Force's order for the new type for testing, which they used for assessing the then new fighter. This represented the start of the US Navy's interest in that aircraft, which only became stronger as the capability of the Mustang began to truly be fulfilled with the introduction of the P-51 and its Packard-built Merlin engine. And that in turn led to what is commonly known of as Project Seahorse, an attempt to build a carrier Mustang. The history of this project is somewhat confused, including the name, as Project Seahorse seems to have been an informal nickname given to the concept by those involved with it. There is also some confusion as to the intentions for this scheme. It is often stated that the project was intended to provide long-range fighter escorts for the upcoming bombing campaign that the United States Army Air Force was actively preparing for against the Japanese home islands. Neither land-based nor carrier-based aircraft had the range to escort the B-29s on their long-range missions, which really got into their swing from late November 1944, when the 20th Air Force began operations from the recently captured Marianas Islands. But that doesn't seem to have been the principal reason for the US Navy's interest in the carrier-capable P-51, though no doubt it could have served that role if such an aircraft had ever been fielded. Instead, the Navy initially requested that their Bureau of Aeronautics investigate more fully liquid-cooled power plants in March 1944. The Navy had already issued orders in late 1943 for both new jet-powered and mixed jet and prop aircraft for assessment, which ultimately led to the McDonnell FH Phantom and the Ryan FR Fireball respectively. But there were concerns that these new aircraft would not perform, as well as a recognition that though radials were getting more powerful, they were also getting considerably bigger, which in turn meant bigger airframes and a consequent impact on the limited numbers of aircraft that could be carried in the cramped confines of a carrier. And so in July 1944, a requirement was put out for proposals for a liquid-cooled inline carrier aircraft that should have superior speed and range to the current fighters conducting operations. Now, to be fair, basically all of the aircraft companies recognised that the US Navy wasn't at all serious about the idea, and simply declined to take part, leaving North American the only builder that displayed an interest. And they proposed the NA-133. This was a navalised version of the lightened P-51L, which was an even more formidable version of the P-51H Superprop that was in production and intended to become the new standard United States Army Air Force Mustang. The NA-133 would have had a Merlin V1650-11 engine that produced 2,270 horsepower with water injection, wingtip tanks, enlarged folding wings, bigger flaps, and arrestor gear. But North American and the Navy also wanted to see how the type would handle the rigours of carrier landings, and so a single P-51D, number 4414017, was modified for testing. Designated as the ETF-51D, the aircraft acquired a tailhook, cattle linkages, and reinforced undercarriage. This began making shore-based test flights in September 1944, so that the pilot, Lieutenant Bob Elder, could get a proper feel for the aircraft, especially in the tricky landing. The P-51's wing was notably not designed for low-speed manoeuvring, and the aircraft had a stall speed of 82 miles per hour. As the arrestor gear was only reliable if the aircraft was not surpassing 90 miles per hour when attempting to land, that's a pretty tight window. However, after conducting 150 flights, Elder was confident in his ability to land the naval Mustang on a carrier, and on the 15th of November 1944, he did just that on the USS Shangri-La. Elder conducted several landings and takeoffs, coming in at a precise 85 miles per hour with each landing. He reported that the aircraft was extremely responsive and that the visibility from the P-51's cockpit for carrier landing was better than purpose-built radial aircraft such as the Hellcat and Corsair because of the much smaller frontal cross-section. But this was in the hands of a tremendously skilled and experienced test pilot, and the ETF-51D certainly had to be very carefully handled, and it was recognised that the type wasn't suitable for deployment. Indeed, after conducting 25 flights, Elder himself concluded that, although I had premiered many US Navy aircraft carrier landings, no such experience had been as interesting as with the Mustang, which I am sure is test pilot speak for probable death trap for the average Joe pilot. Plus, by this point, the aircraft was essentially redundant anyway, either as an escort for the B-29 raids or as a high-speed long-range fighter for the carrier fleet. In early 1945, the island of Iwo Jima fell to the advancing US forces, allowing USAAF P-51s to provide escort to the bombing campaign, while the US Navy was soon to field even more formidable fighters equipped with radials while actively working towards deploying jets with even better performance on their carriers. And North American weren't too bothered either, as they had just received an order for a new jet design evolved from the P-51 for the Navy, the FJ-1 Fury. This would go on to form the basis for a whole new family of fighters and attack aircraft, most famous of which is the F-86 Sabre. So that is the story of the P-51 Seahorse, a fascinating little footnote in the story of one of the most famous fighter aircraft to ever fly. I must give a shout out to Tommy Thomason's blog. He seems to have made available the most in-depth research into this aircraft and the project overall outside of published material, and you can find a link at the Military Matters website to that if you want to read it. And I also owe viewer Tony Z thanks for requesting this aircraft. I do try to get around to all the requests I get, though they literally number in the thousands, but this one was just too interesting to leave long in the to-do pile. Anyway, hope you found the video interesting, thanks for watching, and I will catch you all next time.